How are your interpersonal boundaries? This is an area of interpersonal communication that is sadly lacking for many of us in our Western society. The distinction between internal and external boundaries is important in personal growth and mental health well-being. However, boundaries can become even more subtle and challenging when they are interpersonal boundaries. Interpersonal boundaries occupy that space between where you end and the other person begins. It's a space often negatively used to covertly challenge, criticize, or send an intimidating or humiliating message to the other person, or some kind of power play. But let's have a look at boundaries in general. Let's look firstly at internal boundaries. So internal boundaries involve the way we manage our own emotions, thoughts and behaviours. They are about self-regulation and self-awareness. These boundaries help you set limits on how you allow yourself to think, to feel or act in response to certain situations. This is also important for our own self-care. Let's start with our emotions. Internal boundaries help you control how much emotional energy you invest in various situations. For example, not letting minor setbacks ruin your entire day is an example of healthy internal boundaries. This is often called emotional regulation. So internal boundaries also involve the ability to filter your thoughts. You might have a rule not to entertain negative self-talk or to consciously limit rumination on past mistakes. This is cognitive control. Internal boundaries can dictate how much you allow yourself to take on or overextend your efforts, particularly at work. So, for example, having a strong internal boundary might mean knowing when to stop working and allow yourself to rest. This is an example of behavioral control. You can ask yourself, am I managing my reactions appropriately? Do I allow myself to get overwhelmed easily? Or do I even have limits? If so, what are they? So let's look at external boundaries. These are the limits we set in relationships and interactions with others. They define what is acceptable or unacceptable behaviour from others towards us and how we communicate these limits. For example, that could be physical space, respecting your personal space, privacy and your own body. It could be time boundaries, managing how you allocate your time with others and how you expect them to respect it. For instance, letting people know when you're available and when you're not. Also, there are emotional boundaries, allowing yourself to feel certain emotions without taking on other people's emotions. For example, in a relationship, you might listen to someone vent, but you don't need to absorb or take responsibility for their feelings. You can ask yourself, am I clear with others about my limits? Do I feel comfortable saying no when I need to? So what's the connection between these two types of boundaries? So while internal boundaries govern your relationship with yourself, external boundaries shape your relationship with others. In particular, I'm talking about, more specifically, about governing the more informal relationships, such as acquaintances and work colleagues, where there are low levels of intimacy. Often, internal boundaries impact how effectively you can maintain external ones. For instance, if you're poor at managing your own emotions, which is an internal boundary, it might lead you to allow others to perhaps take advantage of your situation which is an external boundary. So strong internal boundaries often translate into stronger external boundaries because you have a clearer sense of self-worth, self-identity, and your personal limits. With practice, this will also lead to a greater sense of self and self-identification. Now, understanding the distinction between these two types of boundaries can help you take control of both your inner life and your interaction with others, fostering healthier relationships and a much more balanced approach to your own self-care. Now, let's have a look at interpersonal boundaries. Now, the distinction between internal boundaries and interpersonal boundaries can be subtle but significant, as both play key roles in emotional well-being and relationships. Let's look at how they differ. As mentioned earlier, internal boundaries are primarily about self-regulation, how you manage your own emotions, your own thoughts and behaviours. They help you maintain balance and protect yourself from being overwhelmed by your own inner experience of thoughts and feelings. Internal boundaries concern your relationship with yourself. They help you control impulsive actions, limit negative thinking, and regulate emotional responses to stressful situations. So examples of internal boundaries around behaviour, thoughts and feelings are not letting yourself procrastinate excessively, which is controlling your behaviour. Limiting self-critical thoughts, which is controlling cognitive patterns. Managing your emotional reaction to rejection or failure, which is emotional regulation. Internal boundaries are crucial for mental health as they help us maintain emotional stability and avoid self-sabotaging types of behaviour. So interpersonal boundaries are focusing on the interactions between you and, more important, others. These boundaries define what is acceptable behaviour in a more intimate relational sense and ensure that you protect your own needs and well-being without overextending yourself for family and close friends. Interpersonal boundaries are more of a focus on psychologically intimate relationships rather than acquaintanceships. Interpersonal boundaries are all about how you manage your relationship with the more important people in your lives. They dictate how much emotional, physical or mental energy you're willing to give and receive in closer relationships. So, for example, saying no to a close friend who asks for a favour that you're uncomfortable with is a verbal boundary. Refusing to engage in gossip or toxic conversations is an emotional boundary. Deciding how much time and energy you spend with family or close friends are time and energy boundaries. So what are the key differences? Well, firstly, understanding the self versus important others. Internal boundaries govern your relationship with yourself, focusing on your internal thought processes and emotional regulation, whereas interpersonal boundaries govern your relationship with close friends, family and intimate partnerships, focusing on how you interact with and set limits on those important people in your life. Also, controlling your internal boundaries are about controlling your own behaviours and responses, so they are entirely within your domain of control. And controlling interpersonal boundaries involves communicating and enforcing limits with others. which I guess requires mutual respect and sometimes negotiation or even renegotiation with those who are close to you. So what's the point of these boundaries? Well, internal boundaries will help you avoid overreacting or internalizing stress, anger, or anxiety, whereas interpersonal boundaries protect you from being overwhelmed by other people's demands or inappropriate behavior, ensuring mutual respect in personal relationships. These boundaries are important for self-care and self-protection. Don't forget that persistent, unexpressed or unprocessed emotions have to go somewhere. Usually they impact your body as a symptom and physiologically as a negative impact on your autoimmune system. So let's look at interconnection. While distinct internal and interpersonal boundaries often reinforce each other, for example, strong internal boundaries like self-awareness and emotional regulation can help you confidently enforce interpersonal boundaries, like standing firm when you say no. Likewise, clear interpersonal boundaries with others can reduce internal stress and overwhelm, improving your emotional well-being. We need to balance our inner world with our outer relationships, leading to healthier, more fulfilling lives. However, managing interpersonal boundaries when someone is being invasive or attempting to define you can be challenging. But it is crucial for maintaining your autonomy, self-respect and emotional well-being. Here's an approach you can use which can be helpful for guiding you in these more subtle situations. Firstly, clarify your boundaries. Before responding to the invasive behavior, it's important to clearly define your own boundaries. Ask yourself, what is acceptable or indeed unacceptable to me? What behavior or comments feel intrusive or overstepping the mark? Being clear on what you are protecting, your values or your time, your personal space or your emotional well-being, helps you confidently assert those particular boundaries. Secondly, communicate directly and assertively. Once you're clear on what your boundaries are, it's essential to communicate them calmly and assertively to the person in question. Here's how I use I statements to frame boundaries in a way that reflects your personal needs without sounding accusatory. For example, I could say, I feel uncomfortable when you comment on my personal life. I'd like to keep certain things private. Or, I appreciate your input, but I prefer to make decisions on my own terms. Stay firm, but respectful. Being assertive doesn't mean being aggressive. Keep a calm tone, but don't waver or indeed apologize for your boundary. For example, I understand your concern, but I need to handle this my way. This ensures you're protecting your boundary while maintaining respect. Thirdly, avoid over-explaining. When someone is invasive, they might challenge or question your boundaries. Resist the urge to over-explain or even justify your reasoning. Over-explaining can weaken the boundary by suggesting that it's negotiable. For example, instead of saying, I don't want to talk about my career because it makes me anxious and I'm not sure where I'm headed, what you can say is, I'd rather not discuss my career right now. This is a clear, concise communication, helping establish that your boundary is firm. Fourthly, it may be necessary to set consequences. In some situations, if the person continues to disregard your boundaries, you may need to set consequences. These are not punishments, but clear outcomes of what will likely happen if that other person continues with their behaviour. For example, if you keep bringing up this topic, I'll need to end this conversation. Another example, if you can't respect my decisions, I will need to distance myself from this conversation. Setting consequences sends a strong message that you are serious about your boundaries, and that continued violations will lead to a change in how you interact. Fifthly, reinforce your identity. When someone attempts to define you by labeling, criticizing, or imposing their views, it's important to reaffirm your identity and values internally. Remind yourself, I have autonomy. Only I get to define who I am and what I believe. Their opinions don't shape my self-worth. They may have views about me, but those views don't define me unless, of course, I let them. In response to such attempts, calmly assert your position. I don't see myself that way, you can say, or that's your opinion, but I have a different perspective on myself. This reaffirms your agency and prevents their definition from influencing your self-concept. You can also maintain emotional distance. When someone continues to invade your boundaries or define you despite your efforts, it's important to emotionally distance yourself. This doesn't necessarily mean cutting them off entirely, but rather not internalizing their behavior or words. I guess you can do this by recognizing their behavior as their issue, understand that their need to control or invade may come from their insecurities or indeed unresolved issues. Also, not engaging emotionally, detach from their attempts to provoke a reaction. You might say, well, I see where you're coming from, but I feel differently. And then disengage. Just disengage from the topic. You can limit contact if necessary. Clearly, if somebody or someone persistently refuses to respect your boundaries, it may be necessary to limit or cut off contact, especially if their behavior is causing ongoing emotional harm. This is particularly true in cases of toxic or persistent manipulative relationships. You might say, I need to take a step back from this relationship until we can have more mutual respect. This step can be empowering because it reinforces that you have control over who has access to your emotional and personal life. So I guess just to summarize, know what or where your boundaries are and what you're protecting. Be direct and assertive without over-explaining in how you communicate. Reinforce and reaffirm your identity and self-worth. Let others know what will happen if boundaries are persistently crossed, and set appropriate consequences. Distance yourself and lift your engagement emotionally or physically if needed. Managing interpersonal boundaries when dealing with invasive people or manipulative dynamics is challenging and takes practice. I encourage you, though, to honour your needs and remain firm, which is key to building self-respect and healthier relationships. Responding to subtle derisory comments or covertly critical questions requires a delicate balance of assertiveness and grace. It's important to maintain your composure, protect your boundaries, and avoid engaging in the negativity while making it clear that you recognize the underlying intent. Here are some strategies and examples perhaps you can use. Also, stay calm and composed. The first step is to keep your emotions in check. If you react with visible frustration or defensiveness, it can give the other person more power. Calmness communicates clear strength and control. For example, interesting point of view, that must be, or thanks for sharing that. These responses are neutral and don't give the other person the satisfaction of seeing you ruffled or discombobulated. Call it out subtly. If you feel comfortable doing so, you can call out the subtle criticism without being confrontational by acknowledging the covert nature of their comment. You bring attention to their behavior while remaining composed. For example, was that meant to be a joke? I'm not sure I understood. Or, that's an interesting comment. What exactly do you mean by that? These responses gently put the person on the spot, forcing them to either explain themselves or backtrack. This makes it harder for them to continue using covert criticism without revealing their intent. Also, I like this one, you can use humour. Using humour can diffuse a situation while sending the message that you're aware of their intentions. This response allows you to protect yourself without escalating the tension. For example, wow, such a backhanded compliment. I'll take what I can get. Or, ouch, did I do something to deserve that? This approach allows you to call out the subtle insult while maintaining a light-hearted tone which can disarm the person and shift the focus. Also, you can use deflect and redirect. This is another effective way to handle derisory comments, to redirect the conversation away from the criticism. This response is particularly helpful when you don't want to engage but still need to maintain control of the interaction. For example, oh, that's an interesting take, but let's move on to something else. Or, I'd rather focus on something more positive. How's your project going? By not engaging with their comment, you deny them the opportunity to provoke a negative reaction while also steering the conversation to a more neutral or a positive topic. You can use silence. Silence can be a powerful response to passive-aggressive or subtly humiliating comments. Sometimes refusing to engage forces the person to confront the discomfort of their own words without the reward of a reaction. For example, simply smile or maintain a neutral expression without responding. A pause, perhaps followed by a shift in conversation, can indicate that you won't dignify the remark with a response. This silence can be more uncomfortable for the other person than a verbal comeback, as it communicates, frankly, your disinterest in playing their game. Also, you can, of course, assert your boundaries. When covert criticism becomes persistent, it's appropriate to assert your boundaries firmly but respectfully. This helps you take control of the interaction and let the other person know that such comments won't be tolerated. For example, I prefer not to engage in conversations where people are being subtly critical. Can we keep things constructive? or I'm happy to discuss ideas, but let's keep things respectful. This approach reinforces that you won't allow yourself to be belittled, even if the attempt is indirect. Also, you can use a reversal. A reversal technique involves flipping the comment or conversation back onto the person, forcing them to reflect on their own behaviour. This subtly exposes their intent without you needing to be confrontational. So, for example, you can say, "What makes you feel the need to point that out?" Or, "I'm curious, what made you say that?" Asking them to explain or justify their comment, you shift the dynamic, putting them on the defensive without directly attacking them. I guess you can also respond with confidence. Sometimes the best way to handle a covertly critical comment is to respond confidently, disarming the criticism by owning your position. This denies the other person the satisfaction of making you feel small. For example, "Well, I'm quite happy with how I handled that, actually." Or, "Yeah, that's my choice and I stand by it." These kinds of responses show that you are self-assured and unaffected by their attempt to undermine you. You can also consider clarifying the intent. If the comment or question feels subtle enough to leave you uncertain about the intent, asking for clarification can help you expose the hidden criticism. For example, "It sounds like you're implying something. Can you clarify what you mean?" Or, "I'm not sure I follow. Are you asking me a genuine question or are you making a point?" These responses encourage the person to be transparent, making it more difficult for them to continue hiding behind their subtle jabs. Finally, challenge with facts. If the subtle criticism is based on misinformation or half-truth, challenge it by calmly presenting the facts. This prevents the person from using ambiguity to belittle you. For example, "Oh, actually, that's not quite right. Here's what really happened." Or, "I can see why you'd think that, but the situation was a bit different. Let me explain." By addressing the factual inaccuracy, you expose the undermining tactic without escalating the conflict. So here are some takeaways. Stay calm and composed. Keep your emotional reactions in check to avoid giving them power. Use subtle acknowledgement. Expose the covert criticism by asking for clarification or turning it back on the person. Assert boundaries, your boundaries, confidently. Let them know covert or passive-aggressive comments won't be tolerated. Redirect or deflect by taking control of the conversation to shift it away from the negative energy. These strategies, with practice, and they do take practice, will help you maintain control and dignity in situations where others are being covertly critical while still holding them accountable for their actions. So if you'd like help with this, please get in touch. Visit my website, stevenelliker.coach, and book a free discovery call. And let's see what's possible.